Hi, I am Sir Job, and today we are going to discuss the beginning of British imperialism in India. We will delve into 5 topics. 1. The establishment of British rule and the East India Company. 2. The doctrine of lapse and annexation policies. 3. The Indian Rebellion of 1857, Sepoy Mutiny. 4. Economic exploitation and the drain of wealth theory. And 5. Social and cultural reforms and resistance. The story of British imperialism in India begins with the East India Company, a trading entity that arrived on Indian shores in the early 17th century. Initially, the company's goal was to trade spices, textiles, and other goods, but over time, it transformed into a political and military power. By the mid-18th century, the company had established itself as a dominant force in India, particularly after the Battle of Plassey in 1757, where Robert Clive's victory over the Nawab of Bengal marked the beginning of British political control. The company used a combination of diplomacy, alliances with local rulers, and military force to expand its influence. By the late 18th century, it controlled large parts of India, including Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, and it established a system of governance that prioritized profit over the welfare of the Indian population. The East India Company's rule was marked by economic exploitation and political manipulation. It imposed heavy taxes on Indian farmers and artisans, leading to widespread poverty and famine. The company also dismantled local industries, particularly the textile sector, to favor British manufactured goods. This economic exploitation was accompanied by a systematic erosion of Indian political structures. The company often interfered in the succession of local rulers, using treaties like the Subsidiary Alliance to control Indian states. Under this system, Indian rulers were forced to accept British protection in exchange for surrendering their autonomy. By the early 19th century, the East India Company had become the de facto ruler of India, with its authority extending over vast territories. However, the company's rule was not without resistance. Indian rulers and communities often rebelled against its policies, but the company's superior military technology and organizational structure allowed it to suppress these uprisings. The company also faced criticism in Britain, where its mismanagement and corruption led to calls for reform. The Regulating Act of 1773 and the Pitt's India Act of 1784 were early attempts to bring the company under parliamentary control, but these measures did little to alleviate the suffering of the Indian people. The company's unchecked power continued to grow, setting the stage for further exploitation and conflict. The turning point came with the Indian Rebellion of 1857, which exposed the flaws and injustices of company rule. The rebellion, also known as the Sepoy Mutiny, was a widespread uprising against the company's policies and practices. Although the rebellion was ultimately crushed, it led to the end of the East India Company's rule. In 1858, the British Crown took direct control of India through the Government of India Act, marking the beginning of the British Raj. The East India Company, once a powerful trading entity, was dissolved, and India became the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. The establishment of British rule in India was a complex process that involved economic exploitation, political manipulation, and military conquest. The East India Company played a central role in this process, transforming from a trading entity into a colonial power. Its legacy is one of exploitation and oppression, but also of resistance and resilience. The company's rule laid the foundation for British imperialism in India, shaping the country's history for centuries to come. One of the most controversial policies of British imperialism in India was the doctrine of lapse, introduced by Lord Dalhousie, the Governor-General of India, from 1848 to 1856. This policy allowed the British to annex Indian states if the ruling king died without a natural heir. Under this doctrine, the British refused to recognize adopted heirs, claiming that the state would lapse into British control. This policy was a direct attack on Indian traditions and customs, where adoption was a common practice to ensure the continuity of royal lineages. States like Satara, Jhansi, and Nagpur were annexed under this doctrine, leading to widespread resentment among Indian rulers and their subjects. The doctrine of lapse was part of a broader strategy of annexation and consolidation of power. The British used various methods to expand their control over India, including military conquest, diplomatic pressure, and legal manipulation. The annexation of Awadh in 1856, for example, was justified on the grounds of misgovernment, but in reality, it was motivated by the desire to control the region's fertile lands and revenue. These annexations disrupted the traditional political and social structures of India, leaving many rulers and their dependents without a source of income or status. The policy also alienated the Indian aristocracy, who had previously been allies of the British. The annexation policies had far-reaching consequences for Indian society. The dispossession of rulers and the loss of their patronage led to the decline of local arts, culture, and education. Many Indian states had been centers of learning and cultural activity, but under British rule, these institutions were neglected or dismantled. The annexation of states also disrupted the economic lives of ordinary people, as the British imposed new land revenue systems that were often harsh and exploitative. The resentment caused by these policies contributed to the growing discontent that culminated in the Indian Rebellion of 1857. The doctrine of lapse and other annexation policies were not just about territorial expansion. They were also about asserting British dominance and undermining Indian autonomy. The British justified their actions by claiming that they were bringing civilization and good governance to India. But in reality, their policies were driven by economic and strategic interest. The annexation of Indian states allowed the British to control valuable resources such as land, revenue, and labor, which were used to fuel the Industrial Revolution in Britain. At the same time, these policies sowed the seeds of resistance and rebellion, as Indians began to question the legitimacy of British rule. The legacy of the doctrine of lapse and annexation policy is a reminder of the exploitative nature of British imperialism in India. These policies not only disrupted the political and social fabric of India, but also laid the groundwork for the nationalist movement that would eventually challenge British rule. The resentment caused by the annexation of states like Jhansi, whose queen, Rani Lakshmibai, became a symbol of resistance, continues to resonate in Indian history and memory. The doctrine of lapse was a tool of colonial domination, but it also inspired a spirit of defiance that would shape India's struggle for independence.